In rabbinic literature, this Noahide covenant becomes ultimately and distantly the origin of the sense of the 7 Noahide Commandments, Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide Commandments. That is to say, the 7 things that universal humanity has to fulfill. Anybody, whether you've ever heard of Judaism or Christianity, or ever heard of the Bible, or ever been to the Penn Museum and looked at the manuscripts in John Eliot's Bible translated into Indian languages or whatever, whether you ever heard of any of that, there's certain things you should somehow know to do or not to do. The prohibitions on idolatry, blasphemy, murder, engaging in various illicit sexual practices, stealing, or eating any part of an animal while the animal is still alive. Oddly enough, as the rabbi said, if you're going to have leg of lamb, you better hope the lamb is dead before you eat the leg. And you laugh at this. I once had a student in a class when I said that it seems kind of a crazy thing, and why would you need to make a law about that? And then I had a student in class who worked in an agricultural college at one point, and for their project they had to do something which I won't specify in mixed company, but it involved eating part of an animal which continued to live afterwards. So I told her she's going to hell. Plus those 6 prohibitions, plus the positive commandment to establish courts of law and justice. That's all a Gentile has to do according to that particular reading of Talmudic tradition. But the notion seems to be there's certain commandments that were given to Adam, and then the prohibition on the limb of a living animal was added on the time of Noah, and so on and so on. All this is an effort to establish some universal morality apart from the specific morality of the Mosaic Torah, the specific morality of Jewish law. You might say there's general revelation or general common grace, whatever you want to call it, natural law at a universal level, and then at a specific level, there's a particular tradition that is associated with the Jewish people. You could compare this with Catholic notions of natural law, as I say, or common grace, or you might want to compare it with Acts 15, the 15th chapter of the Acts of the Apostle, where the question comes up, well, what is it that you expect the Gentiles to observe in the early church? What kind of compromise can we come to between those who want a law-free gospel and those who want a gospel which Gentiles who become Christians have to observe Jewish law? And there's a kind of compromise in Acts 15 behind which many people think you see this notion of the 7 Noahide commandments. Now, for the rabbis of the Talmud, that's the rabbis living in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries and beyond in antiquity and late antiquity, this subject of Noah versus Abraham comes up. This likenesses that we've just seen between the biblical texts provokes in them not a source-critical observation about those must come from the same antecedent document within the Torah, but rather a notion that, a homiletical notion that these individuals have certain merits, and we should ask who has greater merits, and which was the greater figure. And behind that, I suspect, a few places where they ask which was greater, Noah or Abraham, I think partly what they're discussing is, well, just how good are the Jewish people relative to universal humanity? Or just how good or how bad is universal humanity relative to the Jewish people. I suspect that's what's behind it, but I can't prove that. So here we have text 4. This is the line of Noah. This is the genealogy of Noah, which here really means this is the story of Noah. It's actually not a genealogy that follows. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his generations. Noah walked with God. Noach ish tzadik tamim haya b'dorotav et ha'elohim hithalech Noach. He was a righteous man, blameless in his generations. Noah walked with God. Seems totally positive, but then in text 5, which we have from Midrash, from ancient rabbinic interpretation of the Bible, they pick on this term b'dorotav, in his generations, in text 5. In his generations, Rabbi Judah and Rabbi Nehemiah differed, 2 rabbis of mid to late 2nd century of the Common Era, both living in the land of Israel, mid to late 2nd century. Rabbi Judah said only in his generations was he a righteous man. By comparison, had he flourished in the generation of Moses or Samuel, he would not have been called righteous. In the street of the totally blind, the one-eyed man is called clear-sighted, and the infant is called a scholar. Okay? And in case you don't get the point, he goes on to give a little mashal, a little parable here. It's as if a man who had a wine vault opened one barrel and found it vinegar. Another and found it vinegar. The third, however, he found turning sour, is just becoming vinegar. It is turning, people said to him. Is there any better here, he retorted. Similarly, in his generations, he was a righteous man. So the idea was, considering the crummy moral level of universal humanity in the time of Noah, he didn't look so bad. But by any more universal standard, he was I think the technical term is, he was a no-goodnik, right? So that's why the rabbis, perhaps plain sense overreading, put a great deal of emphasis on this in his generations. He was blameless in his generations, meaning they only tell you that because in another generation he wouldn't have been saying anything special. All right, so that is Rabbi Judah's position. Rabbi Nehemiah said, we're towards the end here of the text 5, if he was righteous even in his generation, how much more so had he lived in the age of Moses? In other words, he was in a lousy generation, yet he was righteous. He was righteous and blameless, tzaddik tamim, in his own generation. If he was that way in his generation, when all the peer pressure was to do all those sorts of things, which we won't itemize, you can see the movie. But if that was the case, and he still maintained his righteousness despite all the peer pressure, then in fact you can imagine how he would have excelled if he were put in a group with people at a higher level. He lived in the time of Moses, the age of Moses, what they think of as an ideal time, not necessarily corresponding to the biblical portrayal of the age of Moses, but had he lived in that time, he would have surpassed, presumably, even Moses. Noah would have surpassed Moses, really an extraordinary statement in the rabbinic context. In a sense, universal humanity has an archetype, has a father who is even, who might even be considered to be superior to the faithful shepherd of Israel, the mediator of the Torah, the figure of Moses. And here's his mashal, here's his parable. He might be compared to a tightly closed vial of perfume lying in a graveyard, which nonetheless gave forth a fragrant odor. How much more so than if it were outside the graveyard? You get a sense of the sanitary practices of ancient graveyards because you smell the putrefying corpses. But you put this little vial of perfume in there, and nonetheless, it overwhelms the smell of the putrefying corpses and continues to smell like Chanel No. 5 or whatever it was. I only know that because I used to watch Queen for a Day when I was a kid, homesick from school, and that was one of the things you got if you got to be Queen for a Day. All these people are too young to even know what I'm talking about here. This is back when there used to be a thing called television, and you got a couple channels, like 2 or 3 channels. They didn't have cable. We won't go into that. But I'm into ancient history. What can I tell you? I'm in the Penn Museum, right? Upstairs, you'll see right next to that Sumerian tablet, a television. Maybe a typewriter or something you never heard of. All right. So the idea is that the graveyard smells, but imagine a perfume such that it continues to give out a fragrant odor even in the graveyard, and the smell of the graveyard does not overwhelm the smell of the perfume. In his opinion, that's what it means when he says that Noah was a righteous man, blameless and righteous in his generations. All the more so had he been in a righteous generation. All right, and we see a similar debate developing with regard to text 6. Again, we go back to Genesis 17. When Abram was 99 years old, his name is not yet changed to Abraham. The Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am El Shaddai, apparently an archaic divine name. Walk before me. Hitalech lefanai v'hiyet tamim. Walk before me and be blameless. That word blameless is the same as you see tamim up there in text 4 relative to Noah. And you see that walking also. But here God says, walk before me. And in text 4 with Noah, he says, Noah walked with God. Noah walked with God. Abraham is at least commanded to walk before God. Now, before God probably simply means in the presence of God. Again, it's possible to overinterpret. You could say this whole exercise of midrashic interpretation that the rabbis engage in is an exercise in overinterpreting or overreading individual words. But I would say yes about that. I would say 2 things. Yes and no. Any questions? Yes, it's an overreading usually over against the plain sense. But no, what this actually does is to generate theologically productive meanings within the structure of rabbinic Judaism. that the way the rabbis think of theology, the way they produce theology, is not through a tractate. It's not through something imitating a philosophical tractate or a philosophical dialogue. The way they produce theology is by interpreting Scripture. The theology they produce may be different from the theology of the Scriptures they're interpreting, but they have a technique that enables them to do that. It's not simply arbitrary, and in the process, it yields what I think is a very, very rich and deep theology. So walk before me. Here we're gonna look at the difference between walk with and walk before. And again, we go back to, in text 7, Genesis Rabbah, a rabbinic midrashic text put together in the land of Israel, maybe in the 5th century, but with sources that are much earlier, including here our now old friends, at least Rabbi Judah, and then also Rabbi Berechia and Rabbi Yochanan, figures of the 3rd century. Noah walked with God, text 7. Rabbi Judah said, this may be compared to a king who had 2 sons, one grown up and the other a child. Again, a classical rabbinic mashal, rabbinic parable. Those of you with experience in the New Testament can see the similarities of this to New Testament parables. To the child, he said, walk with me. You have a little toddler, you want the toddler to walk with you. But to the adult, he said, walk before me. Similarly to Abraham, whose moral strength was great, he said, walk before me. Of Noah, whose strength was feeble, that's Rabbi Judah's position, it says Noah walked with God. God wanted Noah close to him because he's not so strong, he can't resist temptation so well. Walk with me, don't get out of my sight. But Abraham is a kind of herald who can go off on his own, walk before me. You don't have to stay with me because you have the moral strength to be a kind of herald or vanguard or whatever of the king. Rabbi Nehemiah said, he might be compared to a king's friend who was plunging about in dark alleys. And when the king looked out and saw him sinking in the mud, he said to him, instead of plunging about in dark alleys, come and walk with me. I'm not totally sure that Rabbi Nehemiah here is still speaking in defense of Noah over Abraham or not. I can imagine an interpretation either way. But he's plunging about in dark alleys. When the king looked out and saw him sinking in the mud, he said to him, instead of plunging about in dark alleys, come and walk with me. He sees the guy staggering around, lost, whatever. It's raining, there's mud pits. Well, here, walk with me. But Abraham's case is rather to be compared to that of a king who was sinking in dark alleys. Now it's God who's going down into the mud. And when his friends saw him, he shone a light for him through the window. The friend of the king's counselor, the Ohev Melech, the king's counselor, shines a light when he realizes it's the king out there who's staggering around and sinking in the mud puddles. He shines a light there for the benefit of the king. Really, quite an extraordinary image, if you think about it, that the king here is God, and Abraham is doing something to shine a light for God. Said he to him, instead of lighting me through the window, come and show a light before me. In other words, why don't you come out of your house and use this light in front of me as I walk along so I don't step in the mud puddles and sink in the mire. Even so did the Holy One bless me. He said to Abraham, instead of showing a light for me from Mesopotamia and its environs, where Abraham begins, come and show one before me in the land of Israel. Right? In other words, walk before me, understood here as make a trek from the land of idolatry, is how the rabbis see it. The land of idolatry, which is Mesopotamia, where Abraham begins. Leave the land of the idol worship, leave the land of the polytheism, leave the land of the general immorality, which is how the rabbis see the youth of Abraham in his Mesopotamian homeland, and come and shine a light, which is to say, spread the knowledge of God as you come into the land of Israel and be a herald for the king, namely God, entering the land of Israel. I mean, as I read it, I may be wrong. I think Rabbi Nehemiah is, in a sense, defending both of them. But I think Abraham comes across as the greater figure. He's the one who's privileged to go before the king, not simply to have to walk with the king. And he's the one who spreads the light. This is an image you have a couple places in rabbinic literature, and even more so in pre-rabbinic literature, Second Temple Judaism, about Abraham's conflict with the world of the idols, and Abraham's discovery of the one true incorporeal God who cannot be captured in an icon. and how he then spreads the knowledge of this as a kind of missionary to the rest of the world, but in the process nearly enduring a martyrdom as a result. I think all that notion of Abraham as the rediscoverer of the one God is behind this, these texts, especially this last passage. And it's an idea that's very well known in Judaism, but also comes into Islam. It's in the Quran itself. Abraham's conflict with his idol-making father and the townsman is actually is alluded to a couple times in the Quran, in the Muslim scripture as well. 7. Similarly, it is written, and he blessed Joseph and said, the Lord before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked. Rabbi Berechia, so now we're into the 3rd century, still in the land of Israel, said in Rabbi Yochanan's name, his teacher, mid-3rd century, early mid-3rd century, and Reish Lakish gave 2 illustrations of this. Rabbi Yochanan said, it was as if a shepherd stood and watched his flocks. So he stood near him. Reish Lakish says, as if a prince walked along while the others preceded him. The prince doesn't just walk in the room, there's an entourage that precedes him. There's a whole delegation of dignitaries who precedes the prince as he walks along. He doesn't just walk in the room, the first person into the room, the first person into the town. On Rabbi Yochanan's view, we need his proximity. The Hebrew is makom here, which they translate here as proximity. We need to be near God. We're like sheep that need our shepherd near us to help protect us. We need to be near the shepherd. We're the sheep that need to be near the shepherd. On the view of Reish Lakish, who sees it as elders preceding a prince, he needs us to glorify him. If the king just walks in by himself, there's not a lot of glory there. If the king walks in with a delegation before him, and there's something of a parade and a certain amount of pomp and circumstance, and then in fact he's glorified. He needs us to glorify him. God needs Abraham to glorify him. Therefore he says, walk before me, be my herald, be my entourage, be my vanguard, and so that the proper glory is given. So you can see in these texts that they notice the similarity of Noah and Abraham, the language that's similar. They then raise the question of whether those similarities are accidental or not. And the answer, of course, is not. Nothing in the Torah, in the rabbinic mind, is accidental. It must say something about the figures themselves, but whether one is better than the other is better, or how one is to understand the small nuances of phrasing, that becomes the basis of a kind of Talmudic debate in texts 5 and 7. Now, all right, I think what we'll do now, okay. There also is a text that I thought would like to talk about that is much later, but it actually makes a criticism of Abraham, not just Noah, but it makes a criticism of Abraham, and wishes to say Abraham falls short of Moses. And I think that also has something to do with Jewish-Christian dialogues and Jewish-Christian debate in late antiquity, which I'll get to. But here we are in text 8. This is from the Zohar. This is a Kabbalistic text, a work of Jewish mysticism from the Middle Ages. Most scholars think put together around the 13th century in the Iberian Peninsula. And here's what it says. Here's the verse on text 8. Abraham drew near and said, will you really sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? God has said he's going to, or has implied he's going to destroy the town of Sodom. And Abraham said, well, wait a minute, how do you know everybody's guilty there? And wouldn't it be a great injustice if you destroy the innocent along with the guilty? Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, would the judge of all the earth not do justice? He stands up and argues with God about his injustice. That may sound strange to you if you think of God as philosophically always in the right and so forth, but the covenantal God of ancient Judaism, I dare say both biblical and rabbinic, is more interactive, more personal, more relational than that. It's possible for God to talk to people and for people to talk back and for people to try to persuade God to act differently, and in some cases they succeed in persuading God to act differently. It may seem philosophically problematic to you. How can the perfect God be persuaded to change his course of behavior? And philosophers have wrestled with that over the centuries. But these midrashim aren't bothered by those philosophical problems. These midrashim are interested in describing the lived religious life and the personal interactions of people with God. So we go now to page 3 here. Rabbi Yehuda said, Who has ever seen a father as compassionate as Abraham? Come and see. Of Noah it's written, God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. And he was silent, saying nothing, not pleading for mercy. What do you think of that? Noah's told, you know what, I'm going to destroy the entire world. You better make a boat. And Noah said, okay, I'll start making the boat, right? And he doesn't care. All these people are going to die. He doesn't care. Okay, I'll start making the boat. But Abraham, as soon as the blessed Holy One said to him, how great is the outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah, I will go down and see. Immediately Abraham drew near and said, will you really sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? Abraham stood up to God and stood up for justice and didn't just say, okay, go ahead and kill him, I'll get out of town. So in this point, you have a kind of a spiritual ideal. The ideal spiritual person, the ideal Jew in this model is not someone who practices laissez-faire. I don't care what the larger society is doing. I'll just live my own particular life according to my own particular high ethical standards, and I really don't care about the people who fall short. No, he's going to intervene mercifully for the sake of the innocent. And as Genesis 18 would have it, his intervention does not just save the innocent. At least what he wants is not just to save the innocent. What he wants is to save everybody for the sake of the righteous. If you can find you find a righteous minority, I'll spare the entire city. And of course, Abraham fails to find the righteous minority, and the city is destroyed. But Abraham gave it a try, and the try was not just, what he was demanding was not just a surgical strike, just strike down the guilty people. It was save the entire city, guilty and innocent alike, for the sake of the innocent. All right. Rabbi Elazar said, even Abraham did not act perfectly. That's an extraordinary statement. Noah did nothing at all. Abraham demanded justice fittingly, so the innocent not perish with the guilty, beginning with 50, and then finally gets down to 10 and gives up. He acted but did not culminate, since he did not plead for mercy unconditionally, for Abraham said, I don't want to claim reward for my deeds. What I understand this to mean is this. Abraham is constantly trying to bargain God down. How many righteous would it take for you to save the entire town? And we start at 50, 40, so on and so on. We get down to 10, and he gives up. Now, I think as the Zohar would have it, Abraham had merits of his own that, in the name of which he might have pled for Sodom. Maybe they have some sort of medieval notion of a transference of merits in the mind that he could you take some of my merits? I'm this highly saintly figure. That's true, but I'm speaking in the name of Abraham now. I'm this highly sensitive, I'm a highly saintly figure. I have more merits than I need. Could you transfer some of my merits to the sinful Sodomites so that they are not going to be destroyed? That's the ultimate act of compassion and mercy, is to do that. But Abraham, in a sense, I think the Zohar is saying, I'm certainly not a scholar of this material, I think it's saying Abraham was too modest, too humble, even to do that. He didn't want to claim reward for his deeds. He didn't want to take these frequent flyer miles and say, could you apply them to somebody else? Because that's acknowledging he has frequent flyer miles. The really humble person, the really saintly humble person, doesn't see himself as a saint. And therefore, Abraham was so modest that he didn't do that. And the implication is, had he done that, had he put his own skin on the line there, put his own skin in the game there, then in fact, it might have worked. But he didn't. He's just stopped. He didn't culminate. He didn't finish it. Lo ashlim, la ashlim, it says in Aramaic. La ashlim. He didn't finish. But who acted perfectly? It says here in the next paragraph. Moses, for as soon as the Holy and Blessed be said, they'd be quick to turn aside from the way. They made themselves a molten calf and bowed to it. What is written? Moses, here's how he translates it. Moses sweetened the face of the Lord his God. Finally saying, and here's what Moses says. When God says he's going to destroy the people of Israel because of the golden calf, here's what Moses says. Now, if you would only bear their sin, now it's just put up with it, carry it away. If you would only do that. If not, please obliterate me from the book that you have written. Obliterate me from the book that you've written, which would make a shorter Pentateuch, make Biblical Studies 101 a shorter a shorter book, and besides, they've already crossed the sea, so you can still have the Cecil B. DeMille 10 Commandments. You can still have a lot of stuff there. Just wipe me out. I don't want any part of this. In effect, Moses here is threatening to resign. If you're going to punish them for the golden calf, a horrendous sin, no one denies it's a horrendous sin, for a horrendous sin, if you're going to punish them, wipe them out for that, wipe me out too, take me out of the book, take me out of the book of life, or whatever book he has in mind here. I don't want any part of it. So he puts his own skin in the game, and he intercedes on behalf of himself. At this point, God's got to think, wait a minute, do I really want to proceed without Moses? But you see, according to the Zohar, Abraham never said that at Sodom. He never got God to say, wait a minute, do I really want to proceed without Abraham? Maybe I better give in. So, but Abraham only cared if there were innocent people among them, otherwise not. He's only pleading for the innocent. He really wasn't willing to say, let's count the guilty as if they're innocent based on my own merits. And this has, those of you with any sort of background in Christian studies and in Catholic theology specifically, I think this will have a lot of resonance for you. It has resonance in something that doesn't get a terribly good press in modernity, especially since the Protestant Reformation, which I consider to be pop culture. I mean, in antiquity, it's only 500 years. Is it going to last? Who knows? But you know, the new religions. Namely indulgences. The notion that the saints have certain merits, that the church is an organism. It's not a collection of disconnected individuals. It's an organic whole. And the merits of the saints, if I understood the theory of indulgence correctly, could be transferred from the saints to the less worthy so as to provide them justification, righteousness. Now, suddenly people without merits can have merits. I might not have any frequent flyer miles. Maybe my brother can give me his excess frequent flyer miles since he's not flying, and that way I'll fly off to heaven. But the underlying, obviously it's open to many, many abuses, as Martin Luther and others have often pointed out. But it's also the case that it reflects a certain kind of generosity on the part of the saint, who in this case, what Abraham should have done and what Moses did, the saint who in fact would volunteer that. I will give up my own merits in behalf of them. I will give up my own merits in behalf of them. And some I think, connections also to something you see a lot in Christian liturgy, where people ask for something in Jesus' name. In other words, that is, we have no right to it. This is what the Christian praying that is saying. We have no right to it. But we ask it in the name of Jesus. And Jews sometimes pray in the merits of the patriarchs, the merits that Abraham asked God to forgive or to grant a blessing for the sake of the patriarchs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a very similar theology to the underlying notion of asking for something in Jesus' name, or to the theology which I think underlies the practice of indulgences when it existed.